Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Morgia, and I am a Senior Analyst with NASA's Office of Procurement, Grants Policy and Compliance. Welcome to our tutorial on internal control and grants management. This video introduces internal control requirements for those managing NASA grants and cooperative agreements. This video focuses on why internal control is necessary, the laws, regulations, and policies that establish the internal control framework for NASA and grant recipients, internal control activities that NASA applies to grant management, and internal control activities that grant recipients must implement when managing NASA grants. In Part 1, I will provide a general overview of the concept of internal control. At the completion of this part, you should have a better understanding of what internal controls are, why entities need internal controls, the core components of an internal control system, and general responsibilities in internal control systems. Internal control is a process implemented by an entity that provides reasonable assurance that the entity's objectives will be achieved. Objectives that entities aim to achieve fall into three broad categories. In the operations category, internal controls aim to enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of an entity's operations. Internal control in the reporting category aims to ensure the reliability of internal and external reporting. In the compliance objective, internal controls ensure an entity's compliance with applicable laws, regulations, and policies. Internal control consists of the plans, methods, policies, and procedures that an entity implements to achieve these three objectives. Federal agencies and grant recipients are required to maintain internal control systems. The Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act of 1982, otherwise known as FMFIA, requires federal agencies to maintain an internal control system that provides reasonable assurance that it is compliant with applicable laws and regulations and safeguarding assets. Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200, or 2 CFR 200, requires grant recipients to maintain an internal control system that provides reasonable assurance that it is managing awards in compliance with applicable statutes, regulations, and terms and conditions. Beside legal and regulatory requirements, entities should have internal control systems because they provide several benefits for an entity's operations. An effective internal control system will increase the likelihood that an entity will achieve its objectives, provide feedback on how well an entity is operating, and reduce and mitigate risks that an entity faces. Entities' internal controls do not exist in silos. They form systems that consist of a series of actions integrated into an entity's daily operations. In a mature and highly effective internal control system, internal control may be indistinguishable from the day-to-day activities that personnel perform. These actions work together to prevent or detect activities that may prevent an entity from achieving its operational, reporting, or compliance objectives. No two entities will have identical internal control systems because of differences in mission, regulatory environment, risk tolerance, or information technology. Within NASA, an oversight body, management, and personnel all play a role in the agency's internal control system. The oversight body is responsible for overseeing management's design, implementation, and operation of an internal control system. NASA's oversight body is the Mission Support Council, or MSC, and the Senior Assessment Team supports the MSC and oversees internal control evaluations and reporting. NASA management is directly responsible for the design, implementation, and operation of an entity's internal control system. Officials in charge at NASA headquarters and centers are NASA's internal control managers. NASA personnel help management design, implement, and operate an internal control system. All NASA personnel have some degree of responsibility for implementing internal controls. In grants management, those personnel include, but are not limited to, grant officers and technical officers. Internal control responsibilities at grant recipient entities also fall into the categories of oversight body, management, and personnel. Due to the varied nature and structure of NASA's recipients, the actors and titles within each category will vary. Examples of oversight bodies within recipient entities may include boards of directors, boards of regents, and audit committees. The Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, refers to these actors as those charged with governance. Management at recipient entities lead and oversee various departments and offices and may include titles such as Director, Dean, Chief Executive Officer, or Chief Financial Officer. Similar to NASA, grant recipient personnel help their management design, implement, and operate an internal control system. In this part, I'll provide a brief overview of NASA's internal control over grants management to give you a better understanding of why NASA manages grants the way it does. At the completion of this part, you should have a better understanding of the laws, regulations, and policies that guide NASA's internal control system. This includes PHMSA, the GAO Green Book, and NASA's policies for internal control. You should also have a better understanding of how these laws, regulations, and policies impact NASA grants and cooperative agreements. PHMSA requires agencies to have an internal control system that provides reasonable assurance that obligations and costs comply with applicable laws, funds, property, and other assets are safeguarded against waste, loss, and abuse, and revenues and expenditures are properly recorded and accounted for. PHMSA requires agencies to prepare an annual statement of assurance that an agency's internal control system fully complies with the requirements in PHMSA. NASA's annual statement is based in part on assessments and audits of NASA's internal control over grants management, and the annual statement can be found in NASA's Agency Financial Report, or AFR. To ensure that agencies can develop effective internal control systems that comply with PHMSA, the statute instructs the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, to establish internal control standards for federal agencies. The GAO's Standards for Internal Control in the Federal Government, otherwise known as the Green Book, provides agencies with an overall framework for establishing and maintaining an internal control system. In support of the annual Statement of Assurance process, NASA's officials in charge must self-certify that their internal control systems, including those for grants, comply with the Green Book's requirements. Per the Green Book, internal control systems are founded on 5 components. These components must be effectively designed, implemented, and operating together for an internal control system to achieve its objectives. NASA's grant internal controls operate within the agency's broader internal control program that adheres to the GAO's 5 components. Component 1 is the control environment, and this component serves as the foundation for an internal control system. To address this component, entities should establish environments that set a positive attitude toward internal control. The second component is risk assessment, and entities assess internal and external risks to achieving objectives and then develop an appropriate risk response. The third component is control activities, and this includes activities that an entity implements through policies and procedures that are designed to achieve objectives and respond to risk. The fourth component is information and communication. Entities use quality information to support an internal control system, and effective information and communication are vital for an entity to achieve its objectives. The fifth component is monitoring. Monitoring is essential to ensuring an internal control system is working as designed and achieving intended results, and ensures the internal controls are adapting to changing objectives, environments, laws, resources, and risks. Maintained by the Office of Procurement, Grants Policy and Compliance, NASA grant policy establishes internal controls across the grants lifecycle that are designed to ensure NASA's grant management activities are implemented effectively and in compliance with applicable laws, regulations, and policies. The NASA Grant and Cooperative Agreement Manual, or GCAM, establishes policy for NASA's grant applicants and recipients. Examples of internal control in the GCAM include a requirement to obtain NASA prior approval before changing a project scope or transferring a principal investigator, requirements to maintain conflict of interest policies, and requirements for entities to track equipment inventories and in some cases submit annual equipment reports to NASA. In Part 3, I will discuss requirements for grant recipients' internal controls. At the completion of this part, you should have a better understanding of internal control requirements for grant recipients per 2 CFR 200 and NASA policy, how grant recipients' internal controls are monitored, and best practices for internal control. Recipients' internal control over grants ensures that entities are meeting their objectives. Internal controls help recipients achieve operational objectives by maximizing the impact of grant funds by ensuring recipients implement federal awards effectively and efficiently. Internal controls also ensure reporting objectives are met by ensuring that recipients' internal and external reporting, especially those related to audits, is reliable and accurate. Lastly, internal control facilitates recipients' compliance with applicable laws, regulations, and policies, such as 2 CFR 200, NASA's Grant and Cooperative Agreement terms and conditions. NASA Grant and Cooperative Agreement recipients are required to maintain internal controls in accordance with 2 CFR Part 200 and NASA's specific internal control requirements found in the GCAM and terms and conditions. 2 CFR 200 contains internal control requirements that apply to all federal financial assistance recipients, and the NASA GCAM and terms and conditions include requirements specifically for NASA's award recipients. 2 CFR 200, Section 303, Internal Controls, requires recipients to establish, document, and maintain effective internal controls over their awards. Recipients' internal controls must provide reasonable assurance that the entity is managing federal awards in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of their award. Although not mandatory, recipients' internal controls should align with either the GAO Green Book or the Internal Control Integrated Framework issued by the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, or COSA. Recipients will need to use their judgment to determine the most appropriate and cost-effective internal controls. Although 2 CFR 200 only recommends that recipients align their internal controls to the Green Book or COSA framework, the guidance explicitly requires recipients to maintain written policies and procedures for specific activities. For example, Section 200.302 Financial Management requires recipients to maintain written procedures to comply with requirements on federal payments, such as the requirement to minimize time between the transfer of funds from a federal agency and the disbursement of funds. Section 200.318, General Procurement Standards, requires recipients to maintain documented procedures for procurement transactions under federal awards, including for the acquisition of property or services. And Section 200.319, Competition, requires written procedures governing procurement competition. Section 200.430, Compensation Personnel Services, states that compensation for personnel services is only allowable on an award if it complies with applicable requirements in 2 CFR 200 and conforms to the recipient's written policy on compensation. Lastly, Section 200.475, Travel Costs, state that travel costs may only be charged to an award if they comply with the requirements in 2 CFR 200 and the recipient's established written policies. To ensure recipient compliance with statutes, regulations, and policy, to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse, 2 CFR 200 applies several control activities to award recipients throughout the grant's lifecycle. Section 200.308, Revisions of Budget and Program Plans, requires recipients to obtain prior approvals for actions such as scope changes, key personnel changes, and inclusion of costs that require prior written approval. This control activity ensures compliance with award terms and conditions and 2 CFR 200 Subpart E cost principles. This also ensures that award modifications support the grant's original goals and objectives. Section 200.328, Financial Reporting, and Section 200.329, Monitoring and Reporting Program Performance, require recipients to submit performance and financial reports, which ensures that recipients are meeting award goals and objectives, spending funds commensurate with award activities. Subpart F, Audit Requirements, requires recipients that expend $1 million or more to obtain a single or program-specific audit. These audits verify the accuracy of recipients' financial statements, and the audits also examine recipients' internal control systems and ensure that the entity is complying with award terms and conditions and 2 CFR 200. 2 CFR Part 200, Section 200.217, Whistleblower Protections, requires recipients to comply with whistleblower protections in 41 U.S.C. 4712 and inform their employees of whistleblower rights. Whistleblower protections enhance accountability and transparency in all activities an entity undertakes. These protections complement monitoring procedures and facilitate timely identification and corrections of noncompliance. In addition to control activities in 2 CFR 200, NASA applies control activities to award recipients to reduce the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. For example, the GCAM requires all recipients to maintain written and enforced conflict of interest policies that require investigators to disclose significant financial interests to their institutions. These policies reduce the risk of research being unduly influenced or biased due to an individual's significant financial interests. NASA awards are also subject to a transaction testing process in which award expenditures are randomly selected for review. Transaction testing ensures compliance with the cost principle in 2 CFR 200 and reduces the risk of inaccuracies in financial statements. Monitoring a recipient's internal control over compliance with federal grants management requirements is implemented through the single audit process. For 2 CFR 200, award recipients that expend $1 million or more in their fiscal year are required to obtain a single audit. Auditors are required to obtain an understanding of recipients' internal control over federal awards and test recipients' internal controls over federal award compliance requirements, such as those in 2 CFR 200 and NASA's terms and conditions. Single audit reports provide an assessment of whether a recipient had sufficient internal controls in place to ensure compliance with applicable requirements. The OMB Compliance Supplement outlines compliance requirements that the federal government expects to be considered during a single audit. Part 6, Internal Control, provides a summary of internal control requirements for award recipients and auditors. The Compliance Supplement provides illustrative examples of specific internal controls for Green Book internal control components that apply to most federal award compliance requirements. Regardless of whether a recipient exceeds the single audit threshold, the Compliance Supplement provides valuable information for recipients developing or enhancing internal control systems. The following are best practices that award recipients can implement to ensure an effective internal control system. First, consider developing internal controls consistent with the GAO Green Book or COSO framework. Second, recipients should develop and document policies and procedures intended to achieve operational, reporting, and compliance objectives. At a minimum, ensure that written policies and procedures required by 2 CFR 200 and NASA terms and conditions are maintained and implemented. Lastly, recipients should monitor and assess the quality of their internal control system and correct identified deficiencies. Let's do a brief recap of what was covered in this tutorial. In this course, you've been introduced to the concept of internal control, its major components, and the objectives of internal control systems. We also discussed the legal, regulatory, and policy framework that governs internal control requirements for NASA and grant recipients. Lastly, we discussed internal control requirements for federal grant recipients and internal control requirements that are specific to NASA and provided best practices for grant recipients. This slide provides URLs for important documents referenced throughout this video. Thank you for viewing this training. Please visit NASA's YouTube Grants playlist for additional trainings on topics such as 2 CFR 200, NASA's grant disclosure form requirements, and submitting grant financial reports. Thanks again.